at people who dissent is that they're conspiracy theorists. Well, there's no sense to dwell on the conspiracy theory idea too much, because the evidence is in, and it's not conspiracy theory. We're in the global level of implementations of well-written, well-articulated, precise, conforming plans, measures, actions, conventions, and so forth. These kinds of instruments, these global instruments, are always put in place by a doctrine that says we have to collapse our wrongdoing to the authority of the higher cause. It used to be called greater interest. Sometimes it's called very many kinds of titles like worldview, shared vision, world mind, world spirit. These phrases that I'm giving you are common in history, were common in the Nazi Party. It's interesting to note that when the Nazi Party went in and created their environmental programs, they created several stakeholder community councils, approximately 750, 790 councils in Germany. They were basically called collaboratives. In these, the decision-making process was prioritized over representative rule. And as they advanced, it became known as Hermann Göring's Reich Force Service. Now, it looked real good in environmental terms, except for little glitches like Auschwitz was described as a environmentally correct community, and it was well landscaped around it. So the environmental apparatus that we're dealing with now, I characterize as a conglomeration of enviropacts, meaning environmental political organizations. One of the things that's evolved in the grassroots community action group, special interest groups, is they've changed from and mutated from non-governmental organizations to what is known now as private government organizations. The collaborative governance doctrine is built in to these non-profit or so-called non-profit organizations. Essentially, they now have authorities over public resources. They're cloaked in many protective titles. The hierarchy extends from the World Wildlife Fund, which is anything but what it appears to be, all the way down to local grassroots collaboratives in your area, in your community. Now, bear in mind always the distinguishing character of these groups is that they're selected and appointed people, not elected. And their authorities are advancing in federal, state, county, city, tribal documents. The personalities of the people in these organizations has reached a level, based on my field case observations, audits, is to the point that I would characterize some of them as para-religious and even cult-like. And that is based on what has been said by dissenters who were participating in the meetings. The extent of these groups' authorities goes to resource allocation, the creation of management rights over public domain, and essentially they become policy makers, and usually they'll embed a social ringer from the community, very powerful selections, a government agency person. There are groups out there that have done the same work in monitoring these organizations, and they've been characterized as stakeholder councils, a myriad of titles. Always they're driven by doctrines such as common purpose. These hierarchies are definitely top-down. They use techniques such as the Delphi technique, where you're either on board, part of the group, or you're isolated, alienated, and basically terminated from the group.
I'm recalling a quote I put from George Bush on the cover of the Free American. You're either with us or you're against us.
That's true. It is that kind of a process, and I don't have to give any opinion on it. Our case files are filled with the exhibits that go to this. The voting system, the democratic system, democratic legislative system in the community is at odds with the collaborative governance system.
No.
The collaborative governance system is a political ideology, philosophy.
What you're talking, what you've been describing here to me is exactly, what communism is. I mean, we got 10 planks on the Communist Manifesto, every one of them intact in America. Abolition of private property. Let's see, we got 1 million homes confiscated, so that couldn't have been private property, could it?
The thrust of the collaborative movement, and as it's driven by other global doctrines, will lead a yellow brick road right back to the door of the UN. The two principal things that I see evolving in the field and actually in local communities is that private property and individual personality are basically abrogated from that system. The collaboratives operate on a consensus of the group, peer pressure, alienation of dissent, or what they call stand-aside provisions. Property rights are carefully excised and done away with. That is the distinguishing marks of their dialogue.
Well, we got a couple more here I want to get your comments on. Number 7 is government ownership of factories and agriculture. Can you say General Motors, maybe Archer Daniels Midland or Monsanto? And of course number 9, we got they just didn't spell out Monsanto here, but they say corporate farms and regional planning.
Well, that's true, and we can take it from this perspective. The ecological habitat doctrine and the human habitat doctrine require rural cleansing. Rural cleansing I've characterized as metroplexing. In other words, the colloidal ownership, that means not real estate, that means actual ownership, possession, personal property that is held by rural people is being done away with, and they're being forced through obviously inclusionary rezoning or tax burdens and so forth. They're being forced into the cities at an alarming rate.
During the Great Depression, William, 30% of Americans lived and worked on farms or ranches. Today, that number is 2%.
And those farms and ranches have been conveyed and converted into a government or a corporate hand. Now, this is very important. The conversion, the conveyance occurs through the commingling of profit and non-profit organizations. To give you an example, Echo Trust and Echo Trust CDE has a embedded profit corporation under the non-profit corporation. The Securities and Exchange Commission years ago very precisely and carefully commingled the books and the roles and the protections on profit and non-profit organizations. This was carefully marginalized and kept out of the public radar scope. The reason was that now you have a situation where the nonprofits are actually profit-making. The biggest scam that's happening in the environmental history of the world is ecosystem services. Ecosystem services sets up the derivative speculation scheme, and the paper trail is the CAFRA paper trail, meaning combined or comprehensive annual financial reports. It doesn't matter whether it's federal or local. If you find that report, you will find a vast difference between the budget of a community and the actual pro forma asset balance sheet that is being used. And what happened was the CAFRA system was used to plunder the local, state, tribal, federal communities. The money went into the speculative system and was carefully washed through into international investments by various firms. This had to happen because the Securities and Exchange Commission made sure to create the avenue. The international import and export investment complex is controlled by the signature of the Secretary of Treasury. In other words, you can get a loan guaranteed by the government people, the government of the United States, the people, and you can buy materials and export materials out of a community into the third world complex where labor and taxation is essentially of no burden at all.
Now, I have the feeling that the work that you're doing with the American Indians, the indigenous population here, you know, you pointed out. I mean, we're indigenous too. You know, I'm born and raised in Texas. You know, I would be an indigenous Texan in exile right now in Arizona.
Our George is a indigenous man in Nevada, Washoe country, and he asked me last year to write a declaration by indigenous people that would apply to every person on the earth. So we did. That declaration's out there and it's moving all over the world. It's essentially appears to be a declaration of independence. You'll hear the word interdependence in all forms now, and they push it because it's breaking down the sovereignty wall. The Lakota Chiefs last year filed a special appearance. That means that they're not submitting to the U.S. District Court of Columbia, to its offices. They're simply notifying. They notified them in a special appearance of their hereditary chief standing and so forth. The particulars are now just a matter of record. Their position is, and I'll quote as best as I can, as I delivered a message to Undersecretary Echo Hawk this year, just at the end of the year. It said to the Secretary, it's from Chief Dave Baldeagle. He said, I stand as your chief. I stand as a chief. I will never give up. I will never give up the land and minerals under the land. Our government is run by whites. Our culture has been neglected. These hereditary chiefs, by the evidence of treaties, are not employees of the tribal IRA system government. The reason that the IRA system government, tribes, can no longer make treaties is very clear in this. They are part of the foreign government, the United States corporation. To be able to make a treaty against themselves would be absurd. So all of the tribal authorities are really a sub-department of the Department of Interior, which is under the master corporation known as the United States, and the United States corporation is registered in England. The U.S. codes are copyrighted in England. So as you can see,
we're run by judges who are members of the British Accredited Registry.
That's correct. The Bar Association system created a misprision of perjury, and to the extent in the chiefs of treason, whereas lawyers were sent in to advise the IRA tribal governments, and actually they had a conflict of interest and duty, is that they could not create an immutable promise to indigenous people because they had a loyalty oath to the U.S. corporation and the Bar Association.
Well, if you hire an attorney, his first duty is to the court, not to you.
That is the overarching problem with the political courts of the United States and what they call the myth of rule of law. The myth of rule of law is to create an appearance of fairness, and that is used to deceive the average person praying before the court in any instrument to make them feel that they're getting a fair shake. The fairness doctrine.
Yeah, just don't bring don't bring that Constitution into my court, a judge will tell you.
Exactly. Sometimes you'll hear them say these words: "The Constitution is lawyer business." Now, the other night at the Kennedy Museum, a retired U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Scotter, said, "If I have something to educate the American people with, it's this. What is your government? What," and very importantly he said, "distinguish and comprehend the three branches of government." And he said the most important aspect that has to be retained in this country is individual liberty. The collaborative system is aimed directly at this point at breaking the barriers between the branches, especially the judiciary and executive. Essentially, the collaboratives, the judiciary and the legislative. Essentially, you're getting a system, once you break those barriers from the branches, you're definitely looking into the dialectic materialism. Sometimes you could say it's communism, you can say it's Marxism, you can say it's fascism. All of those doctrines are now participationism.
That's all to divide and conquer. Oh, you're a liberal. Oh, you're a conservative. Oh, you're a Republican. Oh, you're a Democrat.
Divide. Yeah, obviously, that's characterizing, disenfranchising, and eventually you become criminalized in doctrines that have been developed by the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, in concert with the Southern
Poverty Law,
right, and the ACO, that say there's thought crimes, and to have a bias, in other words, they create a bias between the parties, and then you get indicted for it. And this advanced to such a degree that the doctrines are on potentiality. So they've established plausible guilt scenarios that mean basically under the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Act.
Okay, and by the way, that act, what nobody seems to understand is that act was put into effect. It was voted in, and we have something now called fusion centers. And what they're doing with the TSA in the airports now, they're doing on the buses. They're doing this is a total invasion of your individuality. They want to strip you naked. They want to know everything you're carrying. And by the way, Ayn Rand had it right. She said the government has no control over honest citizens, so they have to make criminals out of us. And we've got 1 in every 31 Americans in prison, on parole or on probation, and most of them are there for doing exactly what you wrote about in the Declaration of Vindication decree of the indigenous hereditary chiefs and headmen. They said, our sovereign indigenous nationality and personality, our sacred estates held in the land, are guarded by our immutable promises to the people, our children yet to be born, embraced by natural thresholds and attributes of life under indigenous posterity. And they are going after our food supplies. And in 1939, they made the #1 cash crop in America a criminal offense to grow our own in the United States. That would be hemp. They called it by another name, but they stole our #1 cash crop, and for the last 50, 80 years, they've been making us criminals if we dare to use or hold or grow that crop.
I'll approach this. One, you have fusion centers, which include the academic institutions. They're called total information awareness, and essentially it follows into a military protocol of full spectrum dominance, and everyone becomes an insurgent, so they create a counterinsurgency. The Declaration of Vindication was in response to observations by the indigenous paralegals, court advocates, and people that were not Bar Association lawyers. They could get nowhere with basically an alien court system. Their concerns were indigenous, and they were up against the surrogate powers of the IRA system. And they said, well, we need an instrument that's going to jump over this. So I wrote the Declaration of Vindication, and that can be used and adapted by anyone in any community. And basically, it's a declaration that can be signed by anybody in the community, and they file it on the court, on the administrators, on the politicians. And when a person is incarcerated and imprisoned or detained, they sign this Declaration of Vindication so that person knows that they are forgiven and vindicated of their wrongful prosecution or persecution if it's based on an unjust and certainly unconstitutional means of taking them and putting them in prison. So the average person, this is very important to understand, the state isn't the source of law. The Pope is not the source of law. The officials, administrators, the agency rule makers are not the source of law. And the reason is this: you cannot derive power from people greater than they possess in the first and final instance. In other words, if people in the community come together and they institute a moray, and it becomes what they would call a law, the tyrannous, and in tyranny it is always evident that you cannot live legally. In other words, the scope of plausible guilt is so wide that anything you do, you can be indicted for. You cannot live legally in a tyranny.
You dare say that there weren't 6 million Jews alive in Europe at the time of the so-called Holocaust? Well, we'll send you to Germany and indict you. I mean,
well, one of the things in dealing with Holocaust is this. There was a Holocaust against the indigenous people of this country.
Yes.
Millions of people were purposely and intentionally murdered, killed, starved, and so forth. And it's going on in a high-tech sense in Lakota country right now through vaccinations that are definitely toxic and lethal.
Oh, just a little mercury won't hurt you for a few years.
Right.
A little squalene won't hurt you for a few years.
The natural foods thing just gave way and was forced under the very covert legislation of 510, which basically says, well, we're going to prevent you from having natural gardens. You're going to be forced to use toxins and so forth. Now, the people behind all of these instruments that are coming forward, from the UN population management team all the way down to your local good-looking little nurses that are going to help you with your family planning, is a eugenics doctrine. It's clear that the people who are making the decisions, and sometimes they're at a jihad level, they're characterized as the oversoul, all the way back in ancient history. They want the population of America significantly reduced under the doctrine of depopulation. The doctrine of depopulation, they use weather warfare, chemical intrusions, a host.
What about these chemtrails that they're spraying on us? I mean, it's like nobody is asking, why isn't the government forcing these planes down? Why aren't they testing this? The snow on top of Mount Shasta and probably Lake Tahoe too has been poisoned by aluminum.
The agents put into some of the chemtrail applications are some of the heaviest and most toxic agents known. And the chemtrail phenomena, in having witnessed it myself directly, and I don't mean looking up in the sky, I mean being on the airplane.
You've been on the airplane? You've been on an airplane that was spraying?
Absolutely. And looked right at it. Now, what happens is that the law used to be the collective organization of the individual's right to a lawful defense. Under the blacks' law system now, the legal inventors changed it to that which is to the advantage of the majority. That means that you can do collective punishment or collateral damage. Warfare is an excellent example of the disregard for the individual's life. While the U.S. citizens sit and watch the television war in the Middle East, they pet their cat or their dog, and if someone were to strike that cat or dog, they would go to war with them. Yet, when they see the movies and the TV presentation by operative journalists, it's merely a war over there, and so what if we kill a few? But the reality is this: the impact in the Holocaust against the Jewish people, the date is not quite correct. There was more Jewish people killed. There was more people killed than what they say in the so-called popularized 6 million figures. So the people who challenge the 6 million and say it was less, well, obviously they're going to get nailed. But when you say this, there was more Jewish people killed than the 6 million, no one's going to indict you for that. And there are political reasons for that. So there was more Jewish people killed. It doesn't matter if there was one Jewish person killed or 10 million or whatever the figure might be. It was still a Holocaust, and it was perpetrated by people that in 1945 were characterized as capos. And when the final scene was played out, the surviving Jewish people took them down in the streets and murdered them with shovels, rakes in their hands. And that included every person they could get to, and they called them collaborators. So the system of collaboration is back again. And they play the Jewish people against the Christians, and this is part of the dialectic method of divide and conquer.